When you're building an overland rig or a travel van or a van life van, there's a lot of things that need to be considered as part of your build. I've covered a lot of that on the channel so far as it relates to our transit van behind me. And one of the most important aspects of the build that needs to be carefully thought out and planned is the auxiliary power system. What's cracking? I'm Dylan from DIY Overdrive. Welcome to the channel. At over an hour long, this is the longest video I've produced on the channel by a long shot. Now, I know that it's going to be kind of a long haul if you're watching it all the way through. There's a lot of really great information. I walk you through step by step every single aspect of building the auxiliary power system, from running wires through the walls to picking out batteries and chargers, and how to build the box and wire it all up. So I know it's long, but it is worth the watch if you're trying to build a box for the first time yourself. If you're new to wiring, anything like that, this video is going to be for you. So I want to thank you all so much for watching. Also, a lot of the gear that I have in the box here is available on Amazon, and I will have Amazon affiliate links in the description below, and I get just a small cut for anybody that uses those affiliate links. So that is a huge part of what keeps this channel alive, and a huge thank you to everyone who uses my affiliate links. One more thing before we get started, the box is right down here. It's something that, in my opinion, unfortunately should be kind of out of sight, out of mind, minus making sure that you're not over drawing from the system and killing your batteries. It's something that really you should be able to just forget about. So I've designed this box in a way that we can hit the road and we really don't have to think about it at all. If we're going to stay somewhere for a few days, we hook up some solar panels, and otherwise we do quite a bit of driving and it stays charged up. Now let's get into the step-by-step of everything it took to build this auxiliary power system. The first step in an electrical process like this is to remove anything that is in your way. In this case, I'm removing seats and the body panels where I know I'll be running wiring through the walls. Anytime I'm working with interior panels, I'm always using these plastic nylon trim tools that help make sure you can remove some of the pins and pry on the panels without damaging them. Something I didn't know until owning this van and actually getting into this process is that the transit vans actually have a consumer access point for 60 amp power. It's fused for 60 amps. Choosing the right wire size or gauge is absolutely essential when you're doing any type of electrical work. Here I'm using gauge 6 wire because it's only running maybe 10 feet, and that's powering a 40 amp charger. Before choosing my wire size, especially for something that's a heavier load, I will normally go to a wire size calculator. There's a whole bunch of them online. Just Google wire size calculator or 12 volt wire size calculator. You can put in how many amps your items are going to be drawing, and it'll make suggestions for a safe wire size. This is particularly important because if you pick a wire size that is too small for the load, you can absolutely burn through it and start a fire. So please double, triple check that you're using the correct size for whatever it is that you're doing. And when in doubt, go bigger. What I'm doing here is a very precise way to measure wire lengths for a particular run. Every time I touch a spot on the vehicle, I'm just estimating that that is 1 arm length of wire. I deliberately measure in a way that will give me excess wire because you can always cut a wire shorter. It's not so fun to have to extend it. What I did was I counted how many times I touched different parts of the van, and then I string out that many arm lengths from the spool. I learned this handy trick from my good friend Chad Schreiber from Schreiber Automotive. Check him out on Instagram at 12 Volt Dreams. Now I'm accessing the fuse panel under the steering wheel in our Ford Transit, and what I just did with that wire that I measured out and cut was crimp it onto a fuse tap, because this is the wire that is going to control or switch on and off the ACC or accessory controlled fuse that I'm going to install in the battery box. This is what will be switching anything in the box that I want connected and powered only when the engine is on. To ensure that this is working correctly, what I do is after I put the fuse tap in, I grab my multimeter and simply test when the engine is off, and then I switch the vehicle on and test that wire again. You can see that I put the black wire up on a ground
and then I'm using the red wire or the positive on the yellow wire that I made to check the current. Once I know that that fuse tap is working correctly, it's time to run that wire up through the dash and through the body panels towards the back. If you're doing this in a Ford Transit, you can see that really I'm just kind of tugging on a few things and it comes off pretty easily. For whatever vehicle that you're doing this on, it's a good idea to look up exactly how to remove the body panels or the trim correctly. Also, as you're doing this, make sure that wherever you're running the wire, there's nothing that's going to crimp or cut or put pressure, pinpointed pressure on the wire to ensure longevity. I'm only running this fused wire a short distance over the door because next I'm installing the McTuning switch panel, and its wire is going to run right alongside this yellow one, and I'm going to put them in a split loom because it's always best to protect your wires as much as you can inside something like a split loom. I use the braided ones. Again, I get those on Amazon. Spoiler alert, I love this McTuning switch panel. This one comes with a wireless remote that is very cool, so that if you want to turn on and activate your lights or whatever accessories it is that you're using, you can do that from outside the vehicle, which is very cool. This panel has RGB, so you can change the color of the buttons or the backlight for the buttons. It works solid and it was easy to set up. I want to give a big thank you to McTuning again for sending this over to us. We absolutely love it. Pick yours up in the link below on Amazon. After I unbox it all, I grab the switched panel itself and its mount, and then take it over to the van to start installing and figuring out exactly where it's going to go. This plastic shelf up here is dual layer plastic, so I just used a couple self-tapper screws to secure the switch panel to the plastic. And knowing that it's dual layer, I was sure that the screw was not going to poke through the bottom. Took me a couple different tries with different tools to figure out exactly what I could use to get this in there. I ended up just using a short screwdriver. It pushed into the plastic pretty easy. If you do something similar, putting self-tappers straight into plastic, just make sure you don't over tighten them so you don't strip out the plastic. At the time of making this video, we are about 2 months into using this panel regularly, and it is still holding very strong. You can see here that I actually started the split loom on this cable off of the camera, and the reason I did that is because it's going to have to pass through that plastic down by the windshield at the end of the shelf, and so it's just another precaution to make sure that I'm doing everything I can to protect the wire. At the point where the McTuning switch panel wire meets up with the yellow fused wire, I start putting them both together into that split loom all the way down the line. This was honestly far more tedious than I was expecting. I don't usually use the smaller sized split loom, and it was really tight and, like I said, tedious. Took some time to get it in there, but I got it. I still remember my first time drilling a hole in a vehicle. It is not as scary as you think. Just think about where you're putting wires, and any holes that you drill for a pass-through, like what I'm doing right now, make sure you use a rubber grommet to protect the wire that passes through it. Here I'm just using a cheap step bit from Amazon, and then I coat it with some ultra black because I didn't really feel like using paint here. But as long as you coat the bare metal after you do any cutting or drilling, you'll be safe from rust. After installing the grommet, send the wire down. I'm at the point now too where the small split loom that I made is going to join up with the larger split loom that I'm putting the main cables in that run to the ground and the charger. Something I like to do when I'm handling a larger split loom like this is to zip tie or tape around it every foot or two, just to make sure that while I'm handling it, it stays nice and tightly shut. Again, using split loom like this is extremely important when you're running through holes and cavities in the body side, because this is going to play a big role in protecting your wire from any sharp edges. You shouldn't run along sharp edges anyway, so keep an eye on what everything is touching, but that split loom is just extra protection. With the cable run most of the way through the side of the van, it's time to figure out how it's going to exit the wall. Getting the wire out of the wall up front was a little tricky because the pillar where the seatbelt is didn't have a good and easy pass through. So instead of going through the pillar and the metal and cutting multiple holes to get through there, I used a hole saw to cut through the thin plastic panel. I prefer not to have wire showing on the inside of the van, even if it's in the split loom, but sometimes I make exceptions for this if I know that it's going to be covered by something or if it's just a short distance, especially when it's in my own vehicle. Once that hole is drilled, I send the wire loom through it and then leave that there until it's time to come back and add a grommet, again to clean it up and protect the wire. With this side of the wire run, I can start putting some of the panels back on. In an effort to keep this wire loom tidy, I opted to drill a couple extra holes in the plastic and run zip ties through it to make sure that I can hold it down and out of the way to make sure nothing is going to catch on it and pull on it. It just keeps it a little extra safe this way. Now that the front is taken care of, it's time to route through the plastic panel in the rear. Before I punch a hole through this plastic though, I need to make sure all the wires are run from the rest of the vehicle. So let's go up to the roof and get that pass-through box started because that is another important part of this process. I got this junction box on Amazon. It has no punch outs or anything pre-made on it, so I drilled the holes myself. And there's these cool inserts that you can put on these boxes that will twist and tighten around the wires that pass through it. So I measured those plastic inserts, then drilled the correct size so that they would fit snug. These are threaded, so what you do is you push them through the hole and then thread the big plastic nut on the back side. And what I do is I use ultra black on both sides of it to make sure that it is ultra sealed with the ultra black, and it does a great job. This is how I've done it for a long time, and it is designed to seal by itself. The ultra black is just extra insurance to make sure no water's getting through. I pick a spot where I want the wire to come through, I punch it, and then I drill it. Anyone that does these type of how-to videos is going to have their own favorite sealant that they use every single time. And in this case, this is polyurethane. It's from Loctite, and it's actually designed for roof and flashing on a house. And this stuff I use on everything that needs to be sealed. It lasts forever, and it does a really amazing job, and it not only seals but kind of works like a glue. And because I'm a little paranoid about water, especially when it's on the roof of our vehicle, I go maybe a little excessive. So I put extra here, and there's obviously a groove in the roof, so I make sure that it is good and filled. And then at the very end, I run a bead around the outside of it also and smooth it out just to ultra make sure that there's no way that this is ever going to leak. So I press it down, I put the grommet on there, I do the same type of a seal with the grommet, just not just to seal it, but to help hold it in place. And because I used so much of this stuff, it was seeming to push back up on it. It didn't want to stay squished down. So I used a few self-tapper screws to screw through the roof, and that really sucked it down and made that seal complete. I'm going to have a dedicated video on how exactly I wired up the 9 lights to each other, but at this point, they're already wired, so stay tuned for that other dedicated video. What I can tell you right now that I did was, of the 9 lights, the 2, or I guess the 4 that are on the outsides, 2 on the left, 2 on the right, I wired up to 1 positive wire so that once it's hooked up to the McTuning switch panel, I'm able to turn on just the outside ones. And then the middle 5 are hooked up to another positive wire so that I can switch on just the outsides, just the middles, or all 9. Whenever I'm doing wiring like this, I always use crimp connectors that have not only the heat shrink on them, but the dual shield. There's this kind of glue that's inside of it where as you heat the heat shrink, the glue will help fill and seal any cavities that might be inside the connector. So it's another good thing to do, especially for anything that's going to be outside, and it helps really secure that connection. The positive wires that I'm running here is, like I said, 1 positive for the outside ones, 1 positive for the insides. Then there's a third one coming from these lights, which happens to be yellow, and it is the amber backlight glow, or DRL. So that's 3 positive wires that I'm going to be running along the roof of the van and 1 ground wire that will be running to the ground. This is another situation where it's a good idea to pull up a wire size calculator to make sure that you are using a thick enough wire and it will be safe when you're powering your accessories. With the wire all crimped together, I run it all out real long so that I can check roughly how long it needs to be before I cut it. Just like I did on the inside, it's especially important to make sure that all wire that is outside or on the exterior of the vehicle is inside a split loom. You want to protect it from the sun. And something I didn't mention earlier is the type of split loom you use is important. There's the cheaper kind of ribbed looking split loom. That stuff can get very brittle in heat and sun. So this braided stuff I've noticed tends to last a lot longer in the elements. Once I get the wire all in the split loom, I zip tie it to the roof rack and make sure it's out of the way so that I can add crossbars and brackets and things later without getting in the way of the wire or having to touch or affect the wire at all. You can see here I also taped off the end of that split loom so that the tape will keep the end of that split loom shut and then also keep the wires tight as they're exiting it. Now I'm running each wire through its own dedicated port in the junction box, and then every time I do this, I leave a little bit of extra wire in the box itself as a sort of service loop so that if I ever have to make changes down the road, I've always got a little extra wire to work with. Then I clean up that service loop, make sure everything is zip tied nicely, and then I start sealing using the same polyurethane that I opened earlier, because these tubes, once you open them, they're going to go bad within a day or two. You can save them if you tape the end of it, but there's a good chance you might have to pry out the dried up part that's in that nozzle if you go to reuse it later. So whenever I open a tube of it, I try to use as much of it as I can. Once each of those ports are sealed, then I use my Tessa tape, which is the best tape that you could possibly use in an automotive situation. So grab your Tessa tape and wrap up the rest of the wire. Like I said, I do not like having any wire exposed to the elements at all when they're on the exterior of the van. Once they're passed through, I go to the inside of the van, and once again, I split loom everything. So once it's in the loom, then I find a good way to run it behind the ducting down that rear pillar. Whenever I'm running wire like this, I always look for places and holes in the body panels to be able to zip tie the wire shut. And sometimes you have to zip tie to other harnesses. It's just whatever is available to be able to zip tie as you go to make sure things stay secure. Then, of course, I pull the panels away again to see if I want to run under things or over, and the best way to do this seemed to be to run right over the top of that ducting down towards the bottom there. So you can see I'm drilling the hole here in preparation for running the wire through there. This is another situation where I'm going to run the wire through first and then later come back and install the grommet. I just don't like to do certain things out of order, where I would rather the wire be exactly where it's going to live before I glue the grommet on, because sometimes if there's imperfections or maybe if there's a little bit of dirt, the glue may not stick the best. So I like to, again, just glue it when I know I'm not going to be messing with the wire more. Also, the grommets that I'm using have somewhat of a grabbing effect that keeps the wire in place, and sending it back through the grommet is not always the easiest. So that's another reason that I like to do that last. Now I go back and make sure that everything is zip tied and is secure for the run. Now it's time for the exciting part, which is building the battery box. Before I can get started with any cutting, I need to know how big the box needs to be. So I unboxed my 2 VVOR 280 amp hour lithium batteries, set them in the van, and did some measurements so that I knew exactly what I needed. Now, I didn't lay out all the peripherals that are going in the box also, because I knew from past experiences and other battery boxes I've made that these 2 batteries are very large, and making the box big enough for those meant I, by default, am going to have enough room for everything else that needs to go in the box. There's nothing special or high-tech going on here. I just made my measurements, drew some straight lines with my level, and cutting it with my cordless skill saw. I'm using 3/4 inch plywood, and I used to use 1/2 inch to keep shape the box is lighter, but I just don't like the way that they screw and nail together. So this is going to be much easier to work with than past boxes I've done. Because I decided to put the batteries next to the wheel well, and they're longer than the wheel well, I cut the box in an L shape so I can utilize the space that's just in front of the wheel well also. I don't think I need to get too deep into the exact measurements of the box, because if you're getting this far into a project, you probably know how to handle wood. It's a pretty basic thing to do, just build the box to fit. It's definitely easier to just build a rectangular box. This one is a little different because of, like I said, how it will be an L shape around the wheel well, but it'll also sit on top of the wheel well in addition to next to it. I apply wood glue before I attach any of the box pieces to each other, where then using welders' terms, I'll tack it together using a finish nailer just to kind of hold it in place while I then grab my drill, pre-drill some holes, and send some screws into it also. So between the screws, nails, and glue, the box will be pretty solid. I'm not exactly a woodworker. I'm not a carpenter. I just have some tools and know how to get myself in trouble. So if you are a woodworker or carpenter and you've got some pointers for me based on what you see, I'm always open to critiques, criticism, and I always like to grow my skills and knowledge, so always happy to hear it. This was a fairly quick project, building this box, but it still feels good after cutting a bunch of pieces, seeing it come together, test fitting. It just is kind of a satisfying feeling. While I like to do a good job and make things fit, I'm not exactly an artist when it comes to stuff like this, so I have no problem using some scrap 2x4s or pieces when I need them, especially in a box or something that is basically never going to be seen. You can see the black paint here where I actually used this wood to paint some of the brackets that I used on the van roof rack. That's what those little spots are from. And if you haven't seen the roof rack video yet, check out the playlist in the description below to see all the videos that I've done to our van. Mocking up the batteries, I realized that I made the box a little too big, which I did. I always build a little bit of slop, not always. Sometimes I build a little bit of slop into things like this so that I can do fine tuning later, which you can see I stack a couple pieces of wood to fill that gap between the side of the box and the battery. And I have no problem with this being a hair big because if anything, it just allows for a little more space for wire and accessories. Now I can make the front of the box, and I'm making this just a little taller than the batteries so that it will hold the batteries in place securely, but I wanted to make sure I had the best access possible for installing and wiring and doing all the things I need to do later with all the accessories and peripherals. This is the first of many holes that I'm going to drill in the box. I'm using a 2-inch hole saw, and this is going to be where the AC cable and the cables from the roof rack will be coming up into the box. The box sits right over the seat brackets perfectly, which is actually really great because I didn't have to create any new mounting points in the floor of the vehicle. I found some longer bolts that fit this space and are long enough to go through the box and into the floor, so that's pretty convenient. If you use these stock mounting points like I did, make sure you clean the threads really well before you send any bolts down into it. Now, I did clean it, but for whatever reason, the first bolt went in really easy and the second one got stuck and it cross-threaded the threads on the bolt itself. Thankfully, the mount in the floor was completely fine. Only the bolt was ruined, and also the bolt pack that I got came with 4 and I only needed 2, so that was best case scenario for me. I recommend cleaning, which I did. I guess I could have cleaned better, but also use some kind of oil or WD-40, something to help lubricate as you're putting the bolts in, and just take it slow and easy. I don't have all the tricks up my sleeves. Like I said, I know enough to get myself into trouble, but I thought this was kind of a cool idea to perfectly mark on the box where the holes need to be drilled for these mounting bolts. I put some Loctite on the 2 bolts to basically act as a blue dye so that when I set the box down carefully, right where it needs to be, on top of those bolts, it basically dyed the wood and gave me exactly the points that I needed to drill. Anytime it comes to precision drilling like this, I get a little bit nervous because what if I happen to drill it a 1/4 inch off and doesn't line up? Wouldn't be the first time. So you're just gonna have to wait a few minutes though before you see whether or not I totally nailed it or totally bombed. I figured you saw enough of me cutting and nailing wood, so the top I made off camera. It's an extremely basic piece, so no need to point that out. What I did to help keep the box in place was just drill a couple holes in the corners at the front of the box where I can throw a couple pins in it. And these pins are something I've just had laying around for a few years now. And, I got them for a different project. I got them from Harbor Freight. And it was a variety pack of these little pin clip things, and I figured someday maybe I'll need them, and now I do. So they actually, after a couple months of having this box, these pins actually worked really great. This is the first box I'm making that will have active cooling in it. I knew that this box, because of the way it's going to be positioned and kind of buried in the van, I knew it wasn't going to get much natural airflow. So this is something that I did to just make sure that everything could stay a little extra cool. I was looking for things that were the same size so that I could trace around it, but then I realized if I trace the spots that are round and then just turn it a little bit, then I can finish the trace. So that's what I did here. The hole for the fan needs to be pretty close to the size of the fan itself. You don't want it to be too big because you don't want air to leak through, and you don't want it to be too small because you don't want to lose efficiency. And I didn't have the right size hole saw. I didn't want to go buy one because I was also just kind of in the mode of getting it done. So I drilled a little hole as a starter point for my jigsaw, then sent the jigsaw around to clear this hole out. I know it's not beautiful at all. It's not my best work, but what I can say is that once I get the felt on here, it will help hide some of those imperfections, and you're not going to be able to see this at all anyway. So I wasn't concerned about how good it looked. I did send the router around it just to help round out some of those corners, which wasn't totally necessary. But like I said, the felt's going on there, and I guess I kind of like the idea of rounded corners anywhere that felt's going to be bending a corner. But maybe I'm overthinking it, because actually I put felt around all the other corners, and that was no problem. Now I'm rambling. Let's move on. Applying felt is a lot easier than people think. I got the felt on Amazon along with the spray adhesive and the stapler. So I started by laying it out and grabbing the lid and setting it down. I positioned it in a way where around the edges I could fold it just to the inside of the lid, and then I used a utility knife, box cutters, to just cut, I don't know, 1.5 inches all the way around the outside of it, so that I had just enough room, like I said, to fold it over. Once it was all cut, I started spraying the adhesive, and this stuff works really, really great. It's extremely tacky and sticky, which is exactly what you would want, and it holds really great. Once it was glued on and all the felt was folded over into the spots where I wanted it, I used the stapler to just kind of hold it all in place to make sure that none of that spray adhesive was going to let go of any of the felt. I did make a mistake and didn't order enough felt, so I had to go into my stockpile in the shop and just grab what I already had, and unfortunately the colors were a little bit different, so I did the best I could, and I actually even spray painted a little bit of black onto the one that had this kind of red hue to it, and then it matched a lot better. But unfortunately there is a seam in a kind of undesirable place. But that's life. You live and learn. This is a box for myself. It's not for a client, so it doesn't bother us. There's a couple things like that where there was either a small mistake or I didn't have exactly perfectly the thing that I needed in the moment, but we were in wouldn't say hurry, but we had a schedule. We were leaving for our trip to Canada and had no time to waste. So if I had stopped and reordered things every single time something wasn't totally perfect, then there's no way that the project would have gotten finished in time before our trip. Earlier, you may have noticed how easily those pins that lock the lid onto the box, how easily they slid into place. And I made the hole just a hair bigger than it needed to be because I knew that the felt was going to create some pressure on the pins and make it nice and tight when I would put them in there. And of course I felted right over those holes for the pin, so I just used my box cutters to kind of break those holes up a bit. If you remember earlier when I said I like to use my polyurethane tube on everything I can. Once I open a tube, it will go bad, so I used that tube to glue a couple of the grommets down onto the box. A few of the holes in the box were specifically for venting or for like an intake port. So that fan that I got is it's pulling the air out of the box and pulling air in through the intake holes. But another one like this right here is a hole for wire. So the grommet's going to keep those wires safe and controlled as I send them in and out of the box. Now I place the box in the van to test fit, but also so that I can mark exactly where I need to drill the hole through the plastic in the wall of the van, so that those charging cables and the McTuning cable and my ACC, that yellow wire that's fused up front, I needed to drill a hole in the plastic so that it could come through into the box. This is another one where, because we were on a time crunch, I did things a little different. Normally, I would glue these grommets on and let them sit overnight before I really did anything with them. But instead, what I did this time was I started sending the wires into the box. I applied that polyurethane to glue them and then kind of just let them sit behind the box, hoping that they would stay in place, which they did. And it wasn't the most convenient way to do it, but it worked. The one that's coming out of the gray trim right here that has the AC and the roof lights wiring coming through, that one pulled out a little bit as it was drying. So every, I don't know, half an hour, I'd go back in there and just kind of push it back into place because for some reason it really didn't want to stay. So that's just another one of those things that you got to deal with every once in a while, especially when you're doing something in somewhat of a hurry. This is one of the more satisfying parts of the build, where I finally got to bolt the box into the van. And I know I made you wait for it to find this out, but those two holes that I drilled for the bolts that bolt this thing down to the floor, I drilled them perfect. So that's a +1 for using that blue Loctite as a kind of a die to mark the holes before I drill. With the box bolted in, before I get started on actually putting the box together, it's time to finally put all of the trim back into the van. So there's some side trim and the headliner, some lights that need to get plugged back in, and it's kind of exciting because this is the point where things are finally starting to go back together after spending some time apart. I know it seems like this video might go by kind of quick because it's kind of happening all at once, but this is actually a multi-day project because, you know, I've got work to do also. I'm grateful to be a self-employed videographer, but that doesn't mean I get to just goof off all the time. So it's a multi-day project and feels good to be finally getting to this point. And the real beast really is wiring up the box and creating all the wires, cutting them to size, crimping, all that stuff, and designing the layout on the inside. So that's what's coming up next. With the grommet up by the driver's seat finally dried and cured, I can use the zip ties to lock the front wire into place. What I'm doing here is taping up the end of the wires, the positive wires that I'm about to connect to the vehicle. That way, once I connect them to the positive side up front, I know that nothing's going to short out back inside the box. The middle stud under the cover on that, I think they call it a consumer access point, is the positive feed for that 60 amp fused power supply. So basically what this is the battery that's just underneath that seat goes to a fuse that comes to this stud, which makes it really easy for setting up auxiliary power systems like this. Because like on the 4Runner, it's really not that big of a deal, but you got to figure out a way to get the wire straight to the battery through the firewall and set up your own fuse and tie off, from the battery. And always make sure your fuses are closer to the power source. And in the case of an auxiliary power system, at least for your charger, the power source is your starter battery. So the fuse needs to be closer to the starter battery. But something like this, where it's just already there on the vehicle, is super cool and convenient to have and makes it a lot easier to just get the project going. And I noticed also as I'm putting this back together that this tray needed to go on before I bolted on the wires. So that's something I had to go back and do. I also used that top stud as a ground because it was one of the better ground points that I could find, and I also noticed that not all of the body panels on the vehicle are perfectly grounded. So you'd never want to just blindly trust that metal is going to be grounded, and my solution for that in this case was to ground as close to the starter battery as I could onto a chassis piece or metal piece that I knew had a solid ground. And then everything else, instead of grounding to the roof rack or something, I actually ran the ground cables all the way back to the battery box itself. With the access point closed back up and all of the trim in the vehicle put back on, I can start moving things around, like putting the seat back in place right where it's going to go for the trip, to make room before I start doing the wiring in the box. Maybe it would be better to make a kind of a checklist before I actually start doing some finishing touches, because there was one hole that unfortunately I forgot to drill. And that said, it actually kind of was fine. It didn't make too much of a mess. It was easy to clean up. And the hole saw cut through that felt really easy. It didn't get twisted or gummed up. So this could have been worse. This side access hole is for the plug that is going to route to the shore power charger. I got this plug for a good price on Amazon, and this is just going to make it easy to take any extension cord and plug it in right there in the side of the box to charge our batteries while we're parked. I would like to save myself the embarrassment of not being too observant, and I just would say, hey, I'm just testing the fan here. But what I was actually doing is testing the fan to see which way the fan motor blew the air so I could mount it correctly. But turns out right on the top of the fan, there was an arrow showing the airflow direction. So just for the sake of maintaining my pride, I'm just saying here, we're testing the fan before I officially screw it on. Thankfully, I've got quite the selection of screwdrivers, so I just grabbed some little wood screws that I had on hand and twisted them into the wood by hand, and it really wasn't too difficult. You don't always need a power drill for something like this. This is my first time doing active cooling, so I learned a couple terms like 4-pin fan, I think is what they called it. And you need a little brain that's going to control the fan. So the brain is what will sense the temperature inside the box and tell that fan to spin or not. So I just used some double-sided 3M tape to secure that little brain controller thing to a couple little pieces of wood, and then I glued the wood to the box. This isn't something that needs to be crazy robust because it's an extremely light little unit. Something that I also wanted to mention, because you never know with something that has active cooling, but I wanted to mention that this fan is absolutely silent. You never know. Again, when you're ordering something on Amazon, it said that it was silent, but I don't always trust descriptions of things, especially on Amazon, but this is definitely one where it was absolutely accurate. Because the last thing you want is for that fan to kick on at night while you're sleeping, because this box is right below our bed. So I was concerned about the noise, which is why I particularly just mentioned it. Now it's time for the long haul. This is always the longest part of building an auxiliary power system, and that is mocking up exactly where everything should go and cutting the wires and connecting it all together in the most efficient way you can. And after doing it, I feel like I always think of better ways I could do it. And maybe if I put a false wall in there so wiring could run behind and kind of out of the way of these things, there's always a better way. But here I'm just kind of going through and mocking up all the different items that I know are going in the box. The first item to get officially mounted to the box is the Renogy charger. And while the king of charging is absolutely going to be something like the RedArc BCDC or Red Vision system with the Manager 30, the Renogy is something that I've looked at for a long time. I've heard good and bad things over the years. It seems like they've been improving. So I like to put my money where my mouth is and actually try out different gear outside of what I'm used to. So that's why we're going with this time, so that I can actually properly test another system. I also want to take this opportunity to discuss some safety concerns around picking what charger is right for your system. So one of the primary limiting factors of a charger is going to be your alternator. You never ever want to exceed 50% of your alternator's ability. So what that means is if you have only a 100 amp alternator on your vehicle, your maximum draw charger needs to be 50 amps, no more than 50 amps if you've got a 100 amp alternator. Now, if you have only a 60 amp alternator, then you can use up to a 30 amp charger. Never ever exceed 50% of your alternator when choosing a charger. Also important, but maybe less so, especially if you have batteries in parallel, like what I'm going to do, is the ability of your battery to charge. How fast can your battery charge? So every battery has ratings. You can usually look that up in the description or in the manual and see exactly what those batteries are capable of. But it's something that you want to double check before you just go throwing on a massive charger onto a small battery. Another thing I want to mention is that a slower charger is generally going to be a more quality charge. So the illustration that I learned from my training at Red Arc is a very cool one. So imagine you're pouring beer into a glass from a tap. A faster tap is going to create a lot more bubbles in the beer. In a sense, a messier pour. A slower tap is going to create a very clean pour and with less bubbles. So the same thing happens in electricity, where a slower charge is going to be a much cleaner charge. So that's part of why it's important to make sure that your charger doesn't exceed the battery's ability. Next, I'm at the short charger. This is something I got on Amazon because it was reasonably priced and had good reviews. It's my first time using or even hearing of this brand, so I was kind of taking a chance in that regard. But again, I can say after a couple months of use, it has been working perfectly. Next, I start mocking up the rest of the peripherals. So the mic tuning fuse box, the other couple fuse boxes that I'm installing, and fuses and bus bars. It can take some time to figure out the best place to put all of these. Something you want to think about is access for wires. You want to make sure that anything that you mount is going to have good access for wires without having to bend them or kink them or do anything that might harm them in any way. Next is to mount the McTuning fuse box. And I haven't used McTuning heavily myself. I've installed them on a couple other projects for customers, but this is my first time using it for one of my own. And I want to say a big thank you to McTuning for sending this over. They make pretty cool fuse panels that are very affordable, available on Amazon with fast delivery, and they do exactly what they're supposed to do. You plug things into them and it switches them on and off. That it just seems to be working perfect. So I'm really happy with it, especially for the price. And I'm always happy to recommend something that if you're on a budget, if you can't afford the best of the best of the best, something like this is going to absolutely get the job done and do it well. Even if it doesn't have all the bells and whistles. But that said, this thing even has a wireless remote, which is very cool, and I'm excited to give that a try. Something I don't make a habit of is letting a pre-made wire determine the position or location of a peripheral, because it's pretty easy to just make a new wire or extend it. But in this case, I did let the roof-mounted AC unit wire that is already fused kind of determine the location of the positive bus bar, partially because it actually was a good spot for the bus bar anyway. And if I can avoid a little extra work, then I'm totally cool with that. Same thing with the first negative bus bar. And sometimes I go into these projects not exactly, like I said, planning every single wire and knowing how much of everything I'm going to need. So you can see here in a little bit that I actually added another negative bus bar because I ran out of space. You can see I spend a lot of time thinking. Sometimes I just sit here and I look and I think and try to figure out exactly where everything's going to go and what I'm going to do next. So the next thing I did was connect the short charger power cable to the plug that I installed on the box. You remember earlier how I said the box is kind of an L shape at the bottom, and I wanted to have some extra space that I could utilize for wiring or peripheral items. Well, you can see here how the short charger power cable is kind of resting down into that cavity, and that's exactly what that's there for any extra or excess wire. Because I always build in service loops, I could cut and modify this cable, but if you don't have to, then why do it? So I'll just keep it as a service loop and let it hang out down there in that cavity. Next, I'm looking for a place to install the Smart Shunt from Victron Energy, which is a pretty cool device. What it does is you run all the grounds, all the negatives through this device, and it's able to measure exactly how much current and power is running through the entire system. So you can check it with your phone because it's Bluetooth, hence the name Smart Shunt, and it will help you forecast exactly how long the system is going to last before the batteries are dead, because it stores memory of the battery capacity, the type of the battery, the settings for where you want it to tell you that it's at 0%. All this stuff, you can customize it and then keep an eye on the usage of the system to make sure you're not overusing it and make sure that your chargers are working correctly. I have a couple more basic fuse panels going in the box. The first one being this taller one that is ACC controlled. So basically the engine goes on, the fuse box goes on, and it will be powered by the auxiliary batteries but switched by the vehicle itself. So the reason for this is something like that Renogy charger or some other peripherals where you might want them to only be on while the engine is on. This is the fuse box that is going to power those items. So instead of running an individual cable from the front of the vehicle to each one of the items that need to be ACC switched, they can all just come right off of this little fuse box. The other small fuse box that I'm installing here is one that I'm going to use for full-time power. It's going to power things like the little charging bay that I will have set up under the fridge. It's going to power the fridge, the charger for the Goal Zero, anything that's going to need full-time power that I can choose to plug in or unplug myself. This is an Amazon Basics brand 1000-watt inverter. It's not pure sine wave. There's nothing special about it, but it's a pretty good price for what it is. If you need something that's more than like a 300 or 400 watt little inverter that you see for $25, this is the next step up from that. But 1,000 watts is really not enough, in my opinion. 2,000 watts should be the minimum for anything that you install permanently in a system, because it's really not that much more money to get a proper 2,000 watt. And you should also go for one that has a pure sine wave. That way it will be safe for all of your devices if you're charging like a computer or anything that's more sensitive than like a kettle. So I ended up actually pulling this one off because we decided we wanted to be able to boil water with our electric kettle as well as power the ice maker, because at the time of making this box, Micah was pregnant and was chewing on ice like crazy. So because we wanted to power more than one thing, and especially the kettle uses a lot of power. So the 2,000 watt inverter that I ended up swapping in did perfect, and that is also linked in the description below. If you remember from earlier, this sleeved cable bundle is the main positive and negative cable that go to the driver's seat, and is also that yellow fused cable and the McTuning cable. You can see here I'm using some stick-on zip tie holders, and these are pretty cool. The self-adhesive does a good job in a lot of situations. For something like this, I'm using small screws to hold it in place though, because I just don't trust the adhesive for a heavy wire like this for long term. With that bundle zip tied up above the chargers, it's time to put ends on the positive and negative leads and connect them. The negative cable goes straight to the bus bar, and the positive one will go straight into the Renogy charger. Again, in the link below, I'll have all of the crimp connectors that I used and the heat shrink and tools like the cutters, the strippers, the crimpers, the heat gun. All will be in the link below so that it makes it easy for you to find on Amazon. And it is an affiliate link, which means that I get a very small cut of the purchase and is by far the best way to support the channel, and a huge thank you to anyone that decides to use my affiliate links. It is a big part of what is keeping the channel alive. Next, I hook up the negative lead from the Renogy charger and send it straight down to the bus bar. You can see here, as I'm sitting and thinking, I realize that I'm running out of space on the negative bus bar already, so I put another one on the left side there, so I've got more space to hook up more items. Remember earlier when I said that the fuse always needs to be closer to the power source than the load? This is how we protect our wires correctly. That is the reason that this cable is so short, because coming out of the Renogy charger, the positive charge port that will be charging the batteries, we want a short cable to go from the charger to the fuse and then from the fuse to the batteries. Right next to that charger fuse is the load fuse, the main load fuse. Everything that gets powered in this box is going to run through that fuse and cable, which is why you can noticeably tell that this is a much larger cable. It's very important to make sure that your wire gauges are correct. And while I didn't pre-plan how many cables and I didn't pre-plan exactly where everything was going to go, I did calculate how much usage everything was going to be pulling in this box to make sure that my wire size was correct and to make sure that my fuse was the right size on that main load fuse. So again, you can go to a wire size calculator online. Google is your friend. It's pretty easy to find, and you can use that to determine the right size wire to make sure that you are safely powering everything in your auxiliary power system. Here I'm using 1/0, single aught, or 0 gauge wire because it's a very short distance that this is all running, and if it was much longer, then you would very quickly need a much larger wire for a 250 amp fuse. I knew based on what I calculated that that was going to be just a little bit higher than what I was actually going to be using in the box. In this video, I'm including some of what I might call a mistake, or just maybe something that I did one way and then changed later on in the video. So here you can see me tying in the first negative bus bar to the other negative bus bar, but I end up undoing this and just sending the 2 bus bars individually to that Victron shunt, so I can free up a little more space on the bus bars and also do a little less daisy chaining. Here I'm running the ACC control cable for the Renogy charger to the ACC controlled fuse box. This is important because we are installing this on a modern vehicle that has a smart alternator, and that's extremely important because a smart alternator will vary in voltage pretty greatly, and so we need the unit to know exactly when the engine is on and off. If you were installing in an older vehicle that just has a standard old school alternator, it would not be as important to install this ACC cable for the charger, but it's something that I think is good habit to do no matter what. Another important note is that every battery type is going to require a different charge type and voltage. So make sure that before you order your charger, you know that it can accommodate whatever type of battery it is that you're going to be using. So in my case, I'm using lithium, and I made sure before I ordered the charger that the charger can accommodate a LiFePO 4 battery. And many chargers are compatible with different types of batteries and will have different ways of setting it up to make sure that it knows exactly what battery it is that you're going to be using. So be sure to take a look at the manual to be able to make those selections accordingly. Now I'm prepping that yellow wire that comes from the fuse tap under the steering wheel. That is going to be what switches, not what powers, but what switches the ACC fuse box here. And here I use a little wire organizer that screws in and the wires can easily pass through just to help keep things a little more tidy. Then I stick a small fuse on there for the Renogy ACC control cable and pick out a label for that spot, which surprisingly enough, they don't have a Renogy ACC cable sticker on the generic fuse box. So I just picked auxiliary. For my own builds, I actually often don't even use these little label stickers because I tend to just kind of know where everything's at, but it's always a good idea to use them and get kind of creative with the generic sticker names for what exactly you're putting it on. Now I'm putting together the cable that has the Anderson plug on it for the solar panels, and this is something that plugs directly into the Renogy charger for that solar input, and then the negative goes to, of course, the bus bar. The Renogy charger comes with a small temperature sensor, which is something you want to put somewhat central in the box. This is going to help that charger determine if it is at safe operating temperature and just keep things safe and optimal for charging. With that, the Renogy charger is all hooked up and ready to put the covers back on. Now we can move on to hooking up the McTuning fuse box. The first thing I'm doing here is routing the negative cable from the McTuning fuse box to an available stud on one of the negative bus bars. As I said earlier, I started running out of space on the negative bus bars, so instead of daisy chaining one bar to the other, I remove that daisy chained one and I go straight from both bus bars to the shunt individually. Next, I'm routing and setting up the antenna for the McTuning so that we can use the wireless controller while we're outside of the van if we happen to need to turn on the lights or do something and don't feel like getting back in the van. We can just bring that remote control out with us, which is another very cool feature of the McTuning fuse panel. Something I learned from my training with Red Arc is a fuse is always going to be safer than a breaker, especially a cheap breaker. A fuse is going to break faster than a breaker, which prevents wires from being able to heat up and potentially cause a fire or something. So I am using, that said, I'm using a breaker here because they're kind of convenient. I'm on a budget, and like I said, there's a few things I'm doing different in this box that's different than normal or different than what I would do in a customer's vehicle because, like I said, I want to put my money where my mouth is. And breakers are technically safe. It's just fuses are more safe. Also, this breaker came with the McTuning, so I'm using it. Like I said earlier, and this is a good example of it, you want the fuse closer to the power source. And for all of these peripherals, the power source is going to technically be that red positive bus bar. So you can see how I've got that breaker very close to the bus bar, and then the longer cable is what is going to run from the breaker to the McTuning fuse panel. This is the point where I realized that McTuning switch panel cable, that is what controls the fuse panel, is inside that wire bundle, and it would be a lot more efficient to be able to pull that wire out sooner instead of running it all the way around those chargers. So I'm undoing these zip ties simply so that I can pull that fuse panel wire or that switch panel wire out a little bit sooner instead of running it to the end. I also want to mention that the McTuning fuse panel has a switch on it where you can make this thing ACC switched to where if the engine's off, it simply will not power anything. Or you can have it where it's full-time power and you have the ability to turn it on at any point, which is what I opted for. I know that I'm good enough about shutting things off, turning off lights when we park somewhere and are going to be away from the van. If you feel like you would rather be safer, then I would say hook up a wire to the ACC controlled port and make sure you flip that switch so that when the engine's on, the McTuning works. When the engine's off, the McTuning shuts off automatically. Totally up to you. Here I'm hooking up the negative wire that came from the roof lights up above. Connecting accessory items like lights to the McTuning fuse box is very easy because they have these cool terminals that you simply unscrew to open up the access and then slide the wire in and screw it down to tighten it. Also want to note that there is a positive and negative access for each one of the channels on the McTuning. You do not need to use the negative port if you are running your negative cables to one of the negative bus bars. That is all part of the system. If you do some research and decide that you want to do negative switching, maybe that's a reason to do it. But I always prefer to keep things cleaner, run fewer wires to the fuse box itself, and just run my negatives to the bus bars. Be sure to calculate the load for each of your accessories before you pick which fuse. This is essential for making sure that you are setting up a safe and reliable system. So for example, one of these positive cables that I'm hooking up right now is running to 4 of my roof lights, and those roof lights claim to be 50 watts each. So I'm doing 50 watt lights, 4 of them, so 50 times 4, divided by 12. So that's going to be watts divided by volts is going to give me the amps. So that's going to be almost 17 amps, which means I'm going to use a 20 amp fuse access on the McTuning unit. Now the McTuning is all hooked up and we can put that cover on. It was right around now that I realized if maybe I had planned a little more or a little different, I could have created somewhat of a false wall to hook some of these things up to and have the wires run behind them into another chamber, so to speak, because the wires, as you can see, can very, very quickly become messy. And not that it's necessarily bad or dangerous, it's just kind of nice when things are clean looking and easy to trace and follow. Anyway, what I'm doing here is just zip tying some of the wire bundles together to help clean things up a little bit so it's not quite as chaotic. Now I'm running a positive lead from the bus bar to the fuse box. Now I'm hooking up a positive lead from the full-time fuse panel to the ACC controlled fuse panel. And the reason for this is I don't need a direct connection, and I'm also kind of running out of space for more fuses, but I don't need a direct connection for the ACC panel because all the wires that are going to be controlled by it and powered by it are going to be very, very low draw. So it is more than enough to just hook it up to a fuse on that full-time panel. And here you can see we're reaching the time of day where my kids get home. I go to dinner, take a break, spend some time with the family, and boom, it's nighttime, and we're working under the beautiful light of the vehicle itself. I extended the positive and negative cables that power that little control unit that powers the cooling fan. But you can see in a minute here that I actually recut the negative because it's just going to one of those bus bars. I didn't need to extend it in the first place. So the power cable, the positive, did need to be extended, and I run it over to the full-time power fuse box. And it goes to that one because if I'm using the shore power charger and turning on lights and the fridge and all the things, that a lot of heat can still be generated even when the vehicle is turned off and we're not driving. So I want to make sure that this thing has full-time power to be able to control that fan as needed. Here you can see me bridging the negative lead from the ACC fuse box to the full-time power one. And I don't have a problem with this right now because, like I said, that ACC fuse panel is going to have such a low draw that I feel perfectly safe sharing a single negative lead for both of the fuse boxes. Now I'm running a slightly larger negative cable from the full-time fuse box to one of the bus bars. I have a couple cables that are going to be powering things like the fridge, the little charging panel that is going to be under the fridge and charging the Goal Zero. And so those are also going straight to that full-time fuse panel. Here I'm installing the cable for the 1000-watt inverter, and yes, there is another breaker that came with that unit that I'm using in the clip here, but I did end up, like I said earlier, replacing that 1000-watt inverter with a 2000-watt one, and when I did that, I installed a proper fuse because I did not want a generic breaker powering such, because I didn't want a generic breaker protecting such a high-powered device. Now it's time to put the batteries in, but before I do, look down in that box by that mounting bolt that keeps the box connected to the vehicle. I put a couple pieces of wood down there at the bottom with holes drilled that will keep the batteries away from those bolts. You do not want anything poking or prodding the batteries. That could be a massive recipe for disaster. So that's why there's that little piece of wood added at the bottom of the box there. I also noticed that I made a small error in building the box and that 45-degree angle brace. The brace was hitting the battery. So I pulled the battery back out, chiseled a little bit of it away, and then it ended up fitting perfect. Because these batteries are 12 volt and so are all of the chargers and accessory load items, everything's 12 volt, we want these two 12 volt batteries to be connected in parallel. And what that means is the negative from one battery is connected to the negative of the other battery. That is how we increase our total capacity without changing the voltage. We remain at 12 volts when we do it parallel. Now, if you connected the negative of one battery to the positive of the other, that would double it from 12 to 24 volts. That's called doing it in series, and that is not what you want to do in this case. Something that is important to note, because I don't feel like I've seen this mentioned enough in other content, is let's call it battery A and battery B. You can see the one that I'm hooking up now, let's just call that A. The negative is going from the smart shunt to the negative of battery A. Now, when I go to hook up the positive cable to the system, I'm going to hook up that main cable from battery B to the main system. That way, the energy is going to flow from the positive of one battery all the way around to the negative of the other battery. This is the proper way to set up batteries in parallel. Another way to say that is the power starts from one battery and ends on the other. Even though they're daisy chained, that's just kind of another way to think about that. Here is where I'm connecting one battery to the other and also hooking up the load and the charger. These two smaller gauge wires, the red and the gray one, are how the Victron Smart Shunt monitor different batteries, particularly 2 batteries. So the red one is correct where I'm putting it. The gray one I set up incorrectly. It was my first time using this smart shunt and I misread it when it said that the gray one, that is for monitoring a different battery system. So if you wanted to monitor the voltage of your starter battery or some other unit, you could do that. But the way I have it set up here is incorrect. It doesn't hurt anything. It just won't be giving you notifications correctly. It won't be reading it correctly and might even provide a warning that is incorrect. So if you don't have multiple battery systems to monitor, only hook up the red smaller gauge wire from the Victron Smart Shunt. What I'm doing here is running a large gauge wire from one of the bus bars to the inverter. And because the box was getting pretty crowded towards the back where the chargers and the fuse boxes are, I decided to run this one around the front side of the box on top of the batteries. What I'm doing now is hooking up the leads from the shore power charger. What I did was I cut off the connectors that came on it because they were not correct for what I needed, and I made my own. Now I put both labeled and blank stickers on the McTuning switch panel to make sure I know exactly what is powering what. So I know exactly which channel is powering which light. I can always pull off the blanks later when it's time to add something new to the switch panel. And now the battery box is completed. Built the box, installed the accessories, hooked up all the wires. The charging is tested and working. Now it's ready to power our adventure to Canada that we left for just 1 week after this.
If you made it to the end of this video and watched the entire thing, I applaud you. I understand that most of you are probably going to skip through it and find the parts that relate to you, and that's totally, completely understandable. That's what I would do also, but like I said, there was a lot of information to cover in this, and what I also will say, if there's any particular aspect or category in this video that you want to see more detail on, like say for the wiring up the lights to each other and getting that process started, I have a lot of questions about that, so that's why I'm going to be doing a video about those too. But if there's other parts of the video that you want more detail on, let me know in the comments below. I'm always eager to receive your feedback. If there's anything that you feel like I could have done better, if there's something that maybe you know better than I do, I'm always open to criticism and I like to learn. So I want to thank you all so much for watching. Please leave a comment, drop a like, hit that subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.